So, good morning and welcome back, everybody. Good morning to Berlin and hello to everybody who's watching online. We had a busy day yesterday. I'm still processing, I haven't stopped. And welcome back to the second day now of the conference on contested cultural property at the end of World War II. I am Susanne Meyer-Abich. I work at the Lost Art Foundation as a contact point for inquiries about Nazi-looted art, known generally as the help desk. And my colleagues in Uwe Hartmann's department asked me to run you through this morning's panel and also the second panel and last panel today after lunch. This morning we start with a panel on talks revolving around the Russian approach to cultural property around 1945. And we're getting an insight first into the strategy of replacing war losses with objects from enemy territory. And following that, we are essentially being taken into the mindset of individual actors and their motivations for looting practices, as we would now refer to them. And in the final paper in this panel, we are looking at how private collections were caught up in the wholesale removal of museum property in the eastern direction. So our first speaker of the day is Anastasia Yurchenko. She is a provenance researcher with long experience on both Nazi-looted art and so-called trophy art. And she worked for 4 years at a museum with a particularly convoluted history at Friedenstein Castle in Gotha, where, as far as I'm aware, looting seems to have been a factor in practically any conceivable context, so very experienced. Before, she worked for the now defunct German-Russian Museum Dialogue, and she recently completed an initial assessment of Nazi-looted art in Saxony-Anhalt, funded by my employer and the organizers of this conference, the German Lost Art Foundation. She also studied at Lomonosov University in Moscow. Anastasia Yurchenko.
Dear colleagues, it's an honor to be here and to speak on the subject that lies in the intersection of provenance research and political history. Our goal is to reconstruct the development of so-called equivalent lists by examining the intentions of the Soviet cultural and political officials and following their genesis. This concept was never clearly defined in the international law, neither recognized as a legal category nor as a codified framework. Yet it functioned as a rhetorical, political, and practical instrument of the Soviet policy during and after the war. It enabled the Soviet Union to justify the removal of the cultural assets from Germany and other territories as a moral and material compensation for its own wartime losses. My presentation addresses the following aspects: war losses of the USSR as a basis for the appraisal, foundation and implementation of the concept of equivalence, and last but not least, the legal dimensions of post-war negotiations and the legacy of the Soviet equivalent policy. Historical context. The Soviet Union experienced dramatic destruction during World War II. Countless objects were looted, damaged, and lost. Despite evacuation campaigns and the efforts of the museum co-workers, who rescued thousands of objects, a substantial quality of the heritage was destroyed. Museum staff have to confront daily emergencies on raiders and bombings. Andrei Chagadaev, curator of the State Pushkin Museum in Moscow, later a member of the Soviet Trophy Brigade, and his colleagues were engaged in defense operations. Already in 1941, a bomb damaged the museum. Another heavy mine struck the museum's courtyard, and blast wave shattered nearly all the roofs. Tons of broken glass filled the space. The roof coverage were not waterproofed, so the custodians took shifts keeping watch in the freezing cold. Indoor temperatures sometimes dropped below 18 degrees zero. Staff recalled, "We threw snow from the gallery directly onto the museum pink staircase. Frost covered the walls, and the marble glimmered in the sun with a rosy shimmer, like a fairy tale palace. By spring 1942, water leaked into the galleries, destroying remaining wall panels. The conditions of the State Tretyakov Gallery were not less severe. 2 bombs hit the museum in 1941. Staff who was on night duty recalled. The sound of falling bombs were both terrifying and overwhelming. It struck the asphalt outside the gallery's entrance from a thudding crash and exploded in the basement. Moments later, a second bomb came down through the glass roof. It landed in the 18th century gallery and exploded. Serafim Druzhinin, the Tretyakov curator, who will also be in the Trophy Brigade in Berlin, described his rounds. Winter 1941-1942. A brutal cold today, below -30. On my night patrol, it feels closer to -60. It's dark during the day. On windy night, the cold is so sharp that your teeth chatter uncontrollably. The destruction of other museums, particularly in the suburbs of Leningrad, were even more awful. In total, millions of books were lost, hundreds of museums were damaged and destroyed. The extent of this catastrophe required not just an emergency response, but also a new way of thinking. What restored justice might look like after the war. Equivalents were responses to loss, expressions of absence, at the same time functioned as a strategic discourse and as a pragmatic solution. Let's try to analyze the logic in which heritage, justice, and material loss were negotiated from June 1943 until the date of the submission of the final lists at the beginning of 1945. The idea was proposed by Igor Grabar. Art historian, an active figure on the political scene, Grabar studied in Germany and knew its collections very well. He was the head of the Commission for the Registration of Damaged Architectural Monuments, thus being responsible for keeping records. He developed a structure for his initiative, a governmental committee called the Expert Bureau, consisting of connoisseurs to be given task of composing the lists. There were 7 members and 57 experts, historians, archaeologists, architects, high school professors, and academic staff of the museums, as well as the political functionaries. They had varying degrees in qualification and political loyalty, resulting in inconsistencies and emotional debates. Experts discussed the methods of appraisal of the damage, which concerned both architectural monuments and museums collection, and the form of their compensation for selected objects from German, Austrian, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian museums and private collections. The methodology must be clear to support negotiations about reparations after the end of the war. It had to be based on the financial calculation as well as on the significance of the losses of the Russian cultural integrity. The core issue was the difficulty of determining the extent of the losses. That was essential for the identification and ratification of equivalents. Grabar remarked, "That's a complex question. I have been working on it over the past weeks, trying to clarify which objects were originally held in the museum, which were evacuated, and which had been lost or taken by the Germans. In this case, recovery must be possible. In most cases, however, it's not feasible. The available information is imprecise or contradictory. Many cities were still under the occupation. One of the most complex aspects was determination of the value. Should they reflect contemporary prices, or should we be based on earlier, more stable economic references, such as the rubles of 1913 and 1927? Grabar advocated for the use of 1927 rubles, a gold standard in Russia. These prices were well documented and internationally comparable. Beyond financial matter, the discourse also reflected issues of national cultural identity. The idea of a significance factor, claiming that Russian artists like Repin should be considered with the same cultural value as Matisse or Menzel in Europe, was debated. Grabar remained a strong advocate for objectivity and warned against improvisation and idealistic inflation, stating, "If we are using equivalents, we cannot allow ourselves any fantasies." By the time the list of equivalents were finalized, Italy declared its capitulation and could not be considered as an enemy anymore. Nevertheless, the Italian collections remained a source of everlasting inspiration and paradoxically continued to be seen as objects of desire, even at the beginning of 1945, where the completed lists had already been submitted to the government. During one of the discussions about financial compensation, it was pointed out, from a country like Italy, we could probably receive nothing but artworks. Grabar regretted the Italian capitulation. We had done an enormous work to define the equivalents, and it's a pity that overwhelming majority of the work was done for Italy. As for the German artworks, it was general intention to be discreet to target them. It seems to me, Grabar, we must restrict from sizing exhibits from German museums, which are considered to be national monuments. They damaged a lot of our historical monuments, but I don't think that these national aspects should be emphasized, advised Grabar. I believe that under no circumstances should we lay claim to those exhibition prizes in German museums that belong to the category of the national monuments. They had an ample opportunity to gain a significant number of French, Italian, and Spanish treasures. The concept of restitution extended far beyond the scope of fine art. Ethnographic, ethnological, technical, and zoological collections were also selected. In total, the equivalent list included approximately 1,800 positions, in which almost 500 were referred to entire collections or entire museums. These lists were compiled with remarkable precision. Each entry was accompanied by justification for the size of the object or collection, including reference to its location, extended over several hundred pages. One example was the complete archive of the German Teutonic Order in Königsberg, described as a key source to the history of the Baltic religion, Lithuania, Belarus, and the German aggression to the east. Private collections were targeted as well. For example, German Göring, so-called ethnographic collection, was described as containing many horns and deer skulls. It represents important material for the comparative study of our own deers and for examining their variability. Birds from Africa, Arctic, from Ethiopia, as well as fish, crocodiles, turtles, lizards from the Berlin Zoological Museums are necessary for the comparative study of the fauna of our own country. There were also museums which were selected in toto, as Rijksmuseum Alexander König in Bonn, containing rich ornithological and entomological collections that would constitute a valuable addition to our zoological museums. The museum was established by profits from the sugar factories in Ukraine, widely known as König's Sugar. Phonetic Museum in Jena was justified in both scientific and ideological grounds. The museum was founded by Ernst Haeckel, a prominent Darwinist. During the fascist period, the museum was adapted to serve the propaganda of militarism, social Darwinism, and racist theories. It's a great value as a model and could be used in our struggle against fascism. In contrast to the art claims, the financial value of these scientific collections was not defined. The role of the Slavic cultural heritage. National consciousness, and especially Slavic identity, was important. Art and culture were used to strengthen patriotic unity. Thus, Slavic heritage gained symbolic weight. Archaeological expert Tolstoy proposed monuments of Slavic archaeology found in Germany. Grabar added the written sources that should be included, for example, the correspondence between Wilhelm II and Nicholas II, described as valuable materials for the history of Russia and for the dynastic and diplomatic relations. Also, military historical materials, such as examples of Russian weapons, including Peter the Great, saber listed as an object of national pride. Uniforms and banners appeared on the list. They were already labeled as trophy items in the lists, meaning that through the compensation, they were being reclaimed back. Byzantine heritage was also targeted. The complete absence of Byzantine textiles in our museums make their acquisition especially necessary. They were widely used in the Kievan Rus and had a strong influence on Russian visual culture. The emphasis of the Slavic objects reflects a tragedy. Equivalents were not only about material loss. It was about reaffirming continuity and reinforcing the Soviet identity as a rightful heir to the Slavic civilization. A dream of super museum. As early as 1944, much grander vision emerged. Soviet Union could draw freely from the vast holdings of European museums. The glory of cultural power began to take shape as the selected artworks included the word masterpieces. For Grabar, the founding of new museums seemed to be a natural and triumphant conclusion to his dream. A museum must be established in Moscow that has no equal anywhere in the world. Even more ambitious proposal came from the Toropin, a staff member of the Research Institute for the Museum Studies. He believed that the materials arriving from the enemy nations could be used for two entirely new museums, a museum of world history and a museum of history of science and technology. Trophy brigades as units were established in the beginning of 1945. They were composed of officers and museum professionals. The task was to identify, select, and transport cultural property from occupied territories to the USSR. Experts didn't consider the possibility that the same fate which befell Russian museum, damage and destruction, might also have been encountered by German museums. Works optimistically chosen to replace the losses of the USSR would themselves be lost in the house of war actions. Dwelling in the memory of the Soviet experts in their collective dreams, some objects didn't exist anymore or were so deformed that they lost their artistic or cultural identity. Upon arrival, many works lost their provenance as damage, missing inventory numbers, similar iconography, lacks of catalogs, and limited expertise didn't allow any attribution. The concept of equivalence was carrying an illusion to heal cultural wounds. The reality was that the act of taking, even in the name of justice, created new asymmetries and new traumas. In the post-war period, cultural restitution became a major topic in the diplomacy, and the Allied Control Council recognized the right to compensate for destroyed cultural property. Soviet delegation interpreted it as a legal basis for equivalency claims. In July 1946, it proposed restitution in kind again, but the US delegation categorically refused. The Soviet approach of the equivalent remained unratified. While USSR presented itself as a partner in a diplomatic discussions, it was at the same time transferring cultural property. So this tragedy of negotiating while simultaneously removing cultural assets turned diplomacy in the mechanism of retroactive legitimation. The legacy of the Soviet equivalent policy persists to this day. A significant number of the removed cultural objects had never been officially acknowledged as such. Instead, they were quietly integrated into the Soviet institutions, often without any documentation of their provenance. Russian museums and institutions became silent custodians of collections that had once belonged to European museums and libraries, as well as to Jewish families. Those possessions had been already looted by the Nazis. In this way, the policy of equivalence silenced not only the narrative of the wartime losses, but also the history of those who had previously been dispossessed. For decades, these objects remained unseen, not only physically hidden in the storages, but also politically erased from the official discourse. It was only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union that some of this displaced collection began to reemerge. In the 90s, Germany and Russia opened negotiations on the return of the cultural property. The challenges have proven tough. In 1998, Russia passed a law declaring many of these cultural assets as compensatory and therefore not refundable. Effectively, the logic of equivalence was retroactively ratified and remains enshrined in the Russian law until this day. This case illustrates an essential point. Compensation is not a noun, it's an active verb. It's a form of continuous political storytelling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very rich in points that one could, continue to talk about for hours. And I'm sure that there are many questions, and some from people who I expect to ask questions. So please, by all means, come to the microphone.
Master, thank you for interesting presentation. I have few short comments. In the beginning of the presentation, you said that equivalence, it was new Russian idea, which is not absolutely true. And you probably looked at my article, which I published in the volume prepared by Kulturstiftung der Länder, because it's a First World War idea, constantly repeated, and partly realized in the form of a restitution in kind from Germany, which created, I'm talking about the altarpiece and the famous Quran, which created later many problems. So it was good nationalistic idea of the First World War, repeated by different nations from Italians to French. The second question, which is very interesting, I think that it's opening for you quite striking venues for further research. It's to which extent this list of equivalents reflected the development of art history and art taste in the Soviet Union in that moment, which you probably already noticed, because if Menzel is God, German romantics are not needed. Like full disregard of Caspar David Friedrich, which we don't want. The third issue is question of restitution in kind and the Allied authorities. Time ago, I made presentation in the Library of Foreign Literature in Moscow on the whole documentation of Control Council of Germany, which is dedicated to the issue of restitution in kind, which initially was demanded not only by the Soviet Union, but also by France and Poland. France fell out because a majority of the lost artworks was found in Germany. Poland had not enough voice. In Russian case, Control Council was ready to look at the issue, but demanded to provide immediately lists of all artworks which were removed already from the Soviet zone of occupation, which of course the Soviet representatives failed to provide, which once and forever stopped all discussion about restitution in kind and made it illegal. Interesting moment, which is making the whole Russian law on artworks replaced to the territory of the Soviet Union in the result of the Second World War, absolutely not valid. Because in preamble of this law, it's written that removal was conducted according to the decision of Control Council of Germany and Allied authorities, which is simply not true. The last thing which I want to say, very short one, it's let's say kind of funny historical parallel, or not funny but tragic. When you showed the glass ceiling of the Pushkin Museum shattered by the German shell, in my eyes, I saw actually fully similar picture, because in 2023, Russian drone fall on the glass ceiling of the National Museum of Ukraine. Fortunately, it did not explode. It just destroyed the ceiling, shattering glass all around the building. I don't know, is my Ukrainian colleagues interested to
move the Ukrainian aspect to a later discussion? I would be very grateful, because I'm tasked with timekeeping, as I say. It's a thankless task. And Christian Fuhrmeister would love to ask something. Sorry about that.
I just try to understand, let's say, the internal logic, the concept of equivalence, because I believe there are at least two in, let's say, not contradiction, but at least fighting each other, and that is the attribution of value based on art historical order, which was, as one may presume, the founding principle of the Russian museums in some regard. Now there's another logic, and that is commercial, and that is the market price issue.
Right.
So I wonder, because you touched upon it, but what was the final conclusion? So this remained in limbo. What is the stronger logic in this regard? Because I've seen documentations indeed adding up prices, whereas the other argumentation, and you just mentioned this, would be, let's say, attributing value according to narratives or understanding of cultural heritage and interpretation. So did it remain in limbo until the very end or not?
Very good question. Thank you very much. I was really analyzing all these points when I was preparing the presentation. In fact, there was no one inherent logic. You know, all these protocols and their meetings, they were reflecting different mindsets. Thus, I tried to follow different lines, which are sometimes really contradictory. And the final logic was not verbally stipulated, there were just the lists. So we can analyze the logic based on the final sources, right? And the final sources, there are 1,745 fine art objects and 1,800 positions for the scientific museums. So that's the facet of this all totally contradictory lines. But I'm happy to share with you more during the pause and just to give you more perspective on different lines of it.
Right. Last one.
Olaf Hamann, Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin. Anastasia, thank you very much for your inspiring report. I have just one question to according museums. So I took part in libraries dialogue with Russian colleagues, and we very often knew that the restitution with German book collections or book collections from Germany was not given to the libraries in the occupied territories and where the destructions of collections was. But the book collections, first of all, went to Moscow, to St. Petersburg institutions, to Tomsk or Perm. Did you recognize the same for according the museums collections, that the museums in the occupied territories that were looted, which collections were looted, or the buildings were destroyed totally, did not receive museums objects from as a kind of restitution?
Yes, thank you very much, Olaf, for this question. Indeed, the same logic as you mentioned is applicable for the art collections, as they were also dispersed and then redispersed into the provincial museums. So there were separate sessions or separate meetings dedicated to the further dispersal of the art objects, to give them to the provincial museums, and it was based also on the criteria, like if there are some duplicates already in this museum, so we can give the pair to another museum. So there are still a lot of German artworks which are in the provincial museums and which were dispersed. And it's a good line, right? It's a good line. I really tried to cut my presentation so short that I didn't touch this aspect. But there are very interesting and also very emotional materials about this.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Right, so may you... Yeah, I just... We continue with Frank Grelka. Our next speaker is a historian at Viadrina University at the Department for Polish and Ukrainian Studies, and his focus is on 20th century Eastern Europe, with a doctorate at Bochum about the Ukrainian national movement under German occupation in both world wars. He's also preparing a book on the Holocaust in Poland, and together with Stefan Rindlisbacher, he recently published a paper in the Provenance Research Association's anniversary volume on the practices of trophy gathering in the Soviet zone of occupation. Frank Grelka, welcome.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this warm welcome. Thank you to the organizers for having me on this panel. So while Anastasia Yurchenko analyzed the concepts, I will talk on the actors, on the Soviet actors, and why I will start away with the paper. On a visit to the Dresden Gemälde Gallery in 1957, the French poet Jean Cocteau turned to his colleague Louis Aragon with a question. I would like to ask you something. I'm very uneducated. Since when have museums existed? How old is the museum, I ask you? Aragon replied with the same naivety. I have to tell you that I know next to nothing about it. I assume that the museum only really came into being after the French Revolution. To which Cocteau replies, so the pictures were collected after the victory and presented to the people as spoils of victory, like captured enemy flags? It seems plausible, then, that the origins of the museum lie in this manifestation of imperialism. End of quote. Indeed, the origins of the modern museum can be traced back to the collapse of the Ancien Régime. And according to the Grande Encyclopédie, the French National Convention established the earliest known museum in the modern sense of the word on 27 July 1793. After the Russian October Revolution, the situation was very similar to that after the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks plundered the art of the Russian Tsarist family and exhibited some of their trophies. They also sold much of these art to Western countries in exchange for expensive foreign currency. In order to regain what they saw as material losses, Stalin's Communist Party orchestrated the confiscation of a significant number of objects from East Germany after the so-called Great Victory over the Nazis. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow interprets restitution in its very own way as compensation for losses in the Second World War. As many of you might be aware of, in 1998, the Russian Duma codified a regulation that since then serves to redefine the legal status of relocated art objects of foreign origin that were found on Russian territory after 1945. From Moscow's perspective, restitution has thus become synonymous with nationalizing looted art of German provenance. However, the Soviet occupation zone, as research has shown, has in fact been the site of a systematic plundering by Soviet trophy brigades. In fact, Soviet reparation policies in Germany focused not only on seizing industrial assets and dismantling industrial plants, but also on the relocation of cultural assets in the course of the so-called compensatory restitution. With the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 and the recognition of the sovereignty of the German Democratic Republic in 1954, there was also readjustment of the repatriation of the cultural assets that had been transferred to the Soviet Union. The actual reason for the meeting between the two French intellectuals in Dresden was the return of the first paintings to the Gemälde Gallery in 1955. It was precisely at this time that the largest repatriation of cultural artifacts from the Soviet Union to East Germany took place within a few months. As illustrated on this slide, one of the most famous examples was the Sixtine Madonna, collected by experts from the Dresden Brigade of the Soviet Art Committee in summer 1945. This talk deals with the ruling practices of the art elites in the Soviet occupation zone. What can everyday life under occupation tell us about the motives behind Soviet restitution? Why did Soviet art experts do what they did? What made them tick? The paper applies the concept of imperial biography postulated by Tim Buchen and Malte Rolf in 2014. According to which, quote, biographies that can be considered imperial are closely linked to the fundamental patterns of order of the empires in which they took place, end of quote. In the context of the German, Ukrainian, Russian project focusing on imperial groundwork led by Viadrina University between 2016 and 2020, biographical approaches initially occupied a marginal position only. The research, which was founded by Volkswagen Foundation and entitled Culture as Spoils of the Second World War, a special inventory of Ukrainian, Russian, and German archive sources on the practice of relocating German art and cultural assets, 1944, 8, what a long title, concerned the relocation of art and cultural assets from East Germany to the USSR. I remember how the Russian historian on the project was amazed about the mindset of the actors when she read the original documents. Quote, "It is deeply shocking that the system for choosing, collecting, storing, and removing the art treasures worked so well. Many of the experts were art historians and still thought that these actions were completely just." End of quote. The following investigation into the motivations between the relocation of art to the USSR is based upon approximately 2,000 news sources. A selection of these sources is available on a public online database. An illustration of this you see on the slide. And this is how it all started. The prominent Soviet painter Igor Graba, he led an office of experts who listed artistic, historical, and scientific objects. During the February Revolution of 1917, Graba was already a member of the Petrograd Soviet's Art Commission chaired by the writer Maxim Gorky. During the Stalin era, Graba, Anastasia Yurchenko has already referred to him in her talk, became one of the most influential figures in the country's cultural establishment. In the 1920s, he became a prominent figure of the nationalization and sale of significant work of arts abroad. He regarded the advance of the Red Army westwards as a valuable opportunity to compensate for significant cultural losses suffered during the interwar period. After the war turned in the summer of 1943, Graba headed a group of Soviet museum experts and art historians listing art and cultural objects from Germany. The objects were to be transferred to the Soviet Union as compensation for war losses caused by the German occupation. However, Graba was already aware that the value of the objects looted by German occupiers in the Soviet Union would not meet his personal aspirations for art. In a letter from September 1944, Graba explained to Stalin that the destruction of the collective farms was not consistent with a global art market. Nevertheless, this did not prevent the Soviet leadership from confiscating art in Germany at random for the amount of the country's infrastructural losses, converted into rubles. Graba's staff included prominent figures in the art world such as Viktor Lazarev, former director of the picture gallery of the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts, and Sergei Troinitsky, former director of the Hermitage. These eminent experts compiled a list of 1,745 objects of fine art with an estimated value of $70 million. Graba made an explicit reference to the peak period of Soviet art exports and the sale of works by Raphael, Titian, and Rembrandt to the US Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon in the 1930s to Stalin. According to Graba, Mellon referred to Soviet dumping prices at the time. With regard to the confiscations in East Germany, the Soviet art experts relied on data from previous transactions of comparable prices at auctions held in Western Europe capitals up to the 1940s to support their valuations. Accordingly, Graba, Lazarev, and Troinitsky listed works by Italian, German, Flemish, and French Renaissance and modern masters, including Bosch, Lucas Cranach, Rubens, and Michelangelo. In February 1945, Stalin ordered the first experts recruited by the Soviet State Committee for Art Affairs to Germany. On the First Belarusian Front, for instance, which was considered central to the advance on Berlin, the Trophy Brigade operated under the command of Andrei Belokopitov, the director of the Moscow Academic Art Theatre, who was later replaced by the director of the State Tretyakov Gallery, Alexander Samoshkin. It was precisely this academic elite that implemented the policy of overcompensation in the occupied German territories. These museum and library directors and party functionaries tied their own careers and the prestige of their museum collections to the plundering goals of their socialist fatherland. How can we understand their careers in occupied East Germany as an imperial collective biography in the context of Soviet occupation policy in East Germany? One of these imperial actors was, shown on this slide, Lieutenant Yevgeny Luchowite. Luchowite was in command of the palaces and historical monuments in the Sanssouci Palace Park complex in 1945. After the war, Luchowite became something of a symbolic figure in the narrative about Soviet cultural policy in East Germany. Born in 1899 near Moscow into an educated middle-class family, Luchowite studied medieval history and later became a professor at Moscow University. He was the author of several monographs and spoke 5 languages, including German. According to the Soviet legend, the Red Army officer was deployed from Moscow in April 1945 with a specific objective of and preventing the demolition of the Hohenzollern cultural treasures in Sanssouci by the so-called fascists. The rescue of art treasures by Luchowite constituted one of the widespread patterns of Soviet justification that were uncovered 20 years ago by the Berlin newspaper Der Tagesspiegel. Today we know that the castles were not bombed and therefore not defensed against the fascists. As technical director of the so-called Trophy Commission of the 47th Army, Luchowite's actual task was to form a so-called park army to secure the cultural treasures in the palaces of the Sanssouci Park and prepare them for transport to the Soviet Union as spoils of war. The following prominent example of an imperial actor demonstrates a systematic approach of the Soviets in their confiscation of culture in East Germany. Nikita Khrushchev's well-known enthusiasm for animals was notorious. In the summer of 1946, the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party visited Leipzig Zoo. In his own words, he had the impression of, quote, a completely untouched zoological garden with an impressive number of exotic animals, such as lions, tigers, and bears, end of quote. In a report to Georgy Malenkov, Khrushchev therefore referred to the zoo parks in Kharkiv and Kiev, which had been destroyed during the German occupation of Ukraine. As indicated in the document from the Ukrainian State Archives, on this slide, Stalin's deputy gave his approval. Khrushchev consequently ordered more than half of Leipzig Zoo's entire population, including crocodiles and elephants and lions, to be relocated to the Soviet Ukraine. The Khrushchev example is intended to illustrate that despite the apparently arbitrary nature of the Soviet confiscation of art and culture, it was in fact always highly coordinated. This process of relocation was one of smooth transitions and operational harmony between the decision makers operating in parallel at union level and the authorities in the German occupied territories, as shown on this slide. In terms of political order, the Soviet state drew on its experience with the nationalization of cultural assets after the October Revolution. In many cases, the same imperial actors who had already promoted the sale of art in the interview era were involved. As these functionaries were themselves party members, they regarded the Soviet occupation zone as a potential location for rebuilding the museum and scientific infrastructure of their own museums. In line with the economic dismantling objectives of the Soviet state in East Germany, these actors ordered the transport of an unknown number of public and private objects by ship and rail to the USSR. It is evident that the USSR claims for compensation for the significant destruction caused by Germany's war against the Soviet Union can be regarded as morally justified. From a pragmatic point of view, it must also be noted that ordinary people ruined by Nazi war of extermination were not in a position to rebuild their homes with the overcompensated cultural assets from East Germany. However, We tend to forget that the relocated art also greatly inspired people in the Soviet Union. The art historian Ludmila Markina from the Tretyakov Gallery recently described how the Sistine Madonna inspired her already as a child. Quote, "I stared at one with a beautiful mother and a child, admiring the beautiful faces. I wonder why there was not even a hint of a smile on them, rather such an immense sadness. That was how this great picture entered my life. Its meaning of a sacrificial, motherly love has become ever clearer to me as the years have passed." End of quote. The only instance of the return of art to a country outside the former Soviet Union pertained to the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church in Frankfurt an der Oder. Whether stolen or displaced, the divine creation and the life of Jesus Christ in the stained glass window of St. Mary's Church will continue to move those who see them. Tellingly, the Russian Duma justified the return to Frankfurt on 17 April 2002 with a quote, "truly unique artistic significance of the windows." In conclusion, it can be said that art has not lost its immaterial value in the eyes of the art experts, regardless of time and space, imperial power and order. Nor has the creativity of its authors and painters been diminished. My personal opinion is that this research would be completely pointless without an awareness of the beauty of art. If only this lecture could have contributed so much, it would have already achieved a great deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating insight into the chain of command, but also into the psychology of displacing artworks. Questions? By all means, go ahead.
It will be not necessary to interrupt me this time. I will be short.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and you are finally addressing a very important point about quality, not only quantity, but quality of Soviet cultural losses during the Second World War. If we are not talking about architectural monuments, but talking only about movable artworks, of course, the quality of loss is not comparable to the Soviet secret sales of late 1920s, early 1930s. But the Second World War is opening a very interesting possibility of replay of traditional Bolshevik thinking. If during the First World War, the slogan was to turn imperialist war into revolutionary war, more or less the same is happening at the end of the Second World War. There is a famous historical anecdote. At some moment, Gulbenkian, who was buying a lot of masterpieces from the Soviet Museum, asked Anastasia Mikoyan, who was a Soviet People's Commissar, how you can sell all these treasures. And Mikoyan laughed and answered, "You are an idiot, because we will come and we will take them back." So the spirit which in some ways was reflected in the operation of trophy brigades.
Thank you.
Right. So, oh, my mic's off. I urge you to ask questions quickly because we have 5 minutes left and there's your chance. Gosh, you flattened them. Christian Vormeister, thank you.
You mentioned, thank you very much. You mentioned the mindset of justifications. Now I turn this around and called it completely just. And I understand why. So there's the professional and the ideological world competing, overarching, and so on. But to me, looking back at, let's say, one of my formative books that I read was Anja Heus' comparison of ERR, France, Soviet Union. There is the same mindset that you may call as, or dub, completely just, because they were convinced. There were German art historians working for the ERR, having no problems whatsoever, despite their museum work, wherever that had been, like Hamburger Kunsthalle or whatever, returning there as professionals to continue the work after 45. So there is again the completely just notion. So what do we do with this? This is an open question. It's only because we are, let's say, third generation people after those events. So what is the idea of the relation of art history and politics in this regard?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. So I would say what I mean by imperial actors is the idea of these museum directors and art experts to indeed identify themselves with the aims of their socialist fatherland of the Soviet Union. That also includes the idea of expansion of territory, not only of plundering art. That also includes the idea of being part of the elite of a world power. And so the identities of the professional identity and the ideological identity somehow mingled in that area and overlapped, and you can trace back this imperial actors' identity, of course, to the Russian Empire in the 19th century. So I thought it would be interesting to look not only at the institution, what we what we have done so far with our project, but also look on the actual persons who were involved in this process and how they interacted. That would be another project with German art experts after 1944.
Thank you very much, which means that I can release you and we will turn to the third talk on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
The last talk on this panel is by Anne Kuhlmann-Smirnov and Ralf Jaeckel. Anne Kuhlmann-Smirnov is currently working on a project on the war-related relocation of cultural assets from the province of Brandenburg, especially to the Soviet Union. That's one of the Lost Art Foundation funded projects. She studied at the Lomonosov University in Moscow and at the University of Bremen and has a doctorate in Black European Studies. She also was a member of the working group on war losses for German museums, from German museums. Ralf Jaeckel is an art historian with a doctorate in architecture and urban history at Humboldt University in Berlin. His first career, I saw that by chance, was in telecommunications, so we are delighted that he abandoned that field to focus on provenance research and the history of collecting. He is technically retired, but I think he is still very much sharing his vast experience and knowledge. Welcome.
Good morning. We, my colleague Ralf Jaeckel and I, are extremely pleased to be invited to this conference and to report on our ongoing project on the context of the relocation of privately owned cultural assets in the Second World War, generously supported by the German Lost Art Foundation. In the course of our studies, the more tangible the bureaucratic and organizational measures became and the more cultural assets could be found, the clearer it became that private collections formed a distinct segment of cultural tradition in their time. It also became apparent that some of the private collections were semi-public, characterizing an art saloon culture specific to their time, such as the Gerstenberg Palais and the Köhler collection. The repressive measures of the Nazi regime between 1935 and 1943 led to the almost complete eradication of Jewish collecting culture, not only in Berlin but throughout Germany. Only very few Jewish collectors were able to protect their objects in secret from state access and safeguard them from the effects of war. A separate collecting culture existed in the surrounding area alongside that of the capital, characterized by a sense of tradition that was both familial and regional historical, and an expression of a specific culture of the landed gentry. Some of these collections could be visited for a small fee. With these aspects in mind, in addition to the well-known collections of the successful financial and business middle classes, previously unknown smaller private collections of the middle classes and nobility are also presented here. For the researcher, this leads to special features in the search for and identification of objects. The collection of Otto Gerstenberg was one of the best-known private collections in Berlin and is closely linked to the rise of the Victoria Insurance to become the most successful German insurance company before the First World War. Gerstenberg's daughter, Margarete, married Scharf, took over the collection after his death in 1935. Soon after the beginning of the war, Margarete Scharf took precautions to secure the collection. She gave 10 paintings, 2 packages with a total of 59 drawings and a book containing proof copies by Goya to the Nationalgalerie for safekeeping. To protect them from air raids, these works were salvaged in the Reichsbank's underground cellar in April 1943. But after a water ingress in the summer of 1944, they were transferred to the flag tower at the Zoological Garden. Found there by the Soviet trophy units in the beginning of May 1945, these parts of the Gerstenberg collection were immediately transported from the zoo bunker to the Soviet Union, together with the treasures of the Berlin State Museums. As privately owned works of art, they were exempt from repatriation from the mid-1950s onwards. The 3 paintings marked in red on the slide are among the artworks from the Gerstenberg collection that are still in Russia today. Margarete Scharf also gave some works to the Statens Museum for Kunst in Copenhagen for safekeeping, which were not later restituted. Works of art stored in the cellars of the Victoria Insurance Company building itself in Kreuzberg were burned during the heavy air raid on February 2nd, 1945. At the end of the war and shortly afterwards, Scharf brought several works of art to the family estate in Oberstdorf in the Bavarian Allgäu region. Most of the artworks rescued at the time are now part of the Dieter Scharf collection in memory of Otto Gerstenberg and have been on display at the Scharf-Gerstenberg Museum in Berlin since 2008. When the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, only few private collectors in Berlin were prepared for the new situation. In the first years of the war, a few private collectors rather hesitantly inquired with the museums about possibilities for bomb-proof storage of their works of art. In 1942, the massive British and US air raids on major German cities, which claimed an unprecedented number of lives, triggered a rethink among state authorities and private collectors. From the beginning of 1943, there were multiple waves of attacks on Berlin with extensive destruction of entire areas of the city. The year 1943, which in every respect marked the turning point in the Second World War, prompted the state, regional and local authorities to offer private collectors guidance on how to protect their art objects, but but above all, to provide bomb-proof salvage facilities. The number of applications from private collectors for the safekeeping of their objects at museums and municipal cultural institutions increased by leaps and bounds. A decree issued by the Ministry of Science, Education and Culture on November 4th, 1943, which was published as an appeal to private collectors in daily newspapers throughout the Reich, called on them to entrust museums with works of art deemed to be of national importance for safekeeping. Applications from private collectors for the safekeeping of less important works of art that were rejected by the museums, as well as applications that were submitted directly to the Berlin City Administration, were incorporated into the salvage facilities of the main cultural office, the Hauptkulturamt, at the Berlin City Council, the Magistrat. Beginning from March 1943 on, after and all these objects were proved by quality and value. Decisions on the applications were made by the provincial conservator of the Reich Capital Berlin, der Provinzialkonservator der Reichshauptstadt Berlin, Walter Peschke. In accordance with the Führer order, construction programs for new shelters were launched after the first air raid by the Royal Air Force on Berlin at the end of August 1940. From the end of 1941, an initially seemingly sufficient number of shelters were available in Berlin. Some of these were used jointly by state and municipal museums as well as by the provincial conservator's office. The most important salvage sites included the two flag towers at the Zoological Garden and in Friedrichshain, which were completed at the end of 1941, as well as several vaults in the New Reich Mint, Neue Reichsmünze, the stocks of the Nationalgalerie, the Kupferstichkabinett, the stocks of the Nationalgalerie, the Kupferstichkabinett, and the Märkisches Museum Berlin, among others, were stored in the deep cellar facilities in the new Reichsbank building on Werdischer Markt. All of these were equipped with modern installations for heating and ventilation, as well as elevators in some cases. On the museum island, cellars and building substructures were used exclusively for the recovery of own collections. The distribution of artworks from the museum's own holdings as well as from private collections to be secured to the new or expanded salvage sites was based, as we have already heard yesterday, on the value categorization of the objects into irreplaceable, value but replaceable, and other. Art objects from private ownership were separated according to holdings and provenance. Our research identified a total of 96 deposits with almost 1,000 privately owned works of art for the state museums alone. The Berlin Provincial Conservator was given use of the tower cellar in the Stadthaus, vaults in the Neue Reichsmünze, and rooms in the anti-aircraft bunkers at the Zoological Garden and in Friedrichshain. Works from the Academy of Arts, the Zeughaus, and other departments of the state museums were stored on a separate floor on the Neue Reichsmünze, as well as in the two anti-aircraft bunkers mentioned above. Space became scarce after just a few months, which, along with war damage, led to increased relocations between storage locations. Most of the official documents relating to the work of the provincial conservator of Berlin, Walter Peschke, were burned in the tower cellar of the Stadthaus on May 2nd, 1945. Nevertheless, in 1947, it was possible, from fragments that had survived, to reconstruct a register of works of art and culture that were transferred from Berlin, public and private property, out of town. Despite its incompleteness, it lists over 500 mostly previously unknown Berlin private collectors and some 7,000 works of art that had been relocated. The overcrowding of Berlin salvage sites prompted the provincial conservator to forward them from summer 1943 on to 22 salvage sites outside Berlin in the distant regions of Silesia and Wartheland, and palaces, manor, and foresters' houses were used, concentrating in clusters along the middle course of the Oder River between Glogau and Frankfurt Oder in Silesia in the forelands of the Sudeten Mountains and along the Wörther and Netze rivers. Characteristic of these relocations of artwork from Berlin is the separate allocation of the objects of different salvage sites to different salvage sites, as a result of which cohesive collections were torn apart. A few weeks before the end of the war, these eastern salvage locations were captured by the Soviet army advancing on Berlin. This creates a vacuum in the historical record of the fate of the relocated cultural assets, especially as all of these relocation sites were assigned to Polish territory in July 1945. These works of art are believed to have been lost or destroyed by fire, destruction, or looting. However, it can be assumed that a large proportion of the relocation goods have survived. Some works may have been confiscated by Soviet trophy units, others by the Polish state, while still others were integrated into the emerging regional museums of the voivodeships in Western Poland. And this is one example of a private collection that was torn apart. The concert singer Niels Kallmann was a great-grandson of the famous portrait painter Julius Schoppe and inherited the family collection consisting mainly of paintings, drawings, and graphic works by Schoppe. The collection was expanded through targeted acquisitions, including the large-format portrait of Princess Marie of Prussia from 1838. As can be seen in the picture of Kallmann's music room, this portrait hung dominantly above the grand piano. There. In May 1943, Kuhlmann gave his collection to Peschke for safekeeping. 73 oil paintings, 4 watercolors, 27 drawings, 45 lithographs, 3 engravings, 3 albums with art sheets. Separately, 37 pieces of furniture owned by Kuhlmann were taken to Balkow Castle near Frankfurt Oder in June 1943 and 27 more to Kuhner Castle in the district of Görlitz. Apparently, some of Schoppe's paintings were later transferred to Oberquell Castle in the district of Glogau, where some paintings from Hans Thomas' legacy were also kept. In 1953-54, 2 paintings by Schoppe and several paintings by Hans Thoma from the storage at Oberquell Castle unexpectedly became part of a gift of friendship from the Polish to the German people, comprising 117 paintings, including Kuhlmann's portrait of Princess Marie of Prussia. It was later taken stock in the Nationalgalerie. In 1991, the portrait was restituted to Lieselotte Meyer, Kuhlmann's sister, and later purchased by the administration of the State Palaces and Gardens of Berlin West, and it is now exhibited in the Glienicke Palace. The situation in the province of Brandenburg, which surrounds the city of Berlin, differs in several respects. At least if, as is assumed, the main sources of the relocation events during the war and afterwards have been found in the fragmentary records. Here it was not the provincial conservator who took charge of the salvage measures, but Oskar Karper, a state museum curator of the province of Brandenburg. Later also, from October 1944 until the end of the war, deputy provincial conservator. In contrast to Berlin, where, as we have explained, the salvage lists of the provincial conservator could be reconstructed, such lists for Brandenburg have not survived or have not been found yet. The attempt to reconstruct the event solely from Karpa's correspondence, which is presumably also incompletely preserved, is correspondingly more difficult. Nevertheless, interesting facets of salvage practice appear, particularly at the relocation sites of Paritz and Metzeltin, which were used by various institutions and, through Karpa, also by private individuals. Relocation activities began at the end of 1942, initially with the Brandenburg Picture Gallery's own holdings, which were transferred to the Rotes Loch provincial estate. In April 1943, the Reichsverteidigungskommissar, Reich Kommissar of Defense of the Mark Brandenburg, sent a letter to the provincial councils with an appeal to all owners and proprietors of manor houses, country estates, and other extensive buildings, but also to church authorities to support the measures to protect cultural assets, in particular by providing accommodation. Corresponding notifications should be sent to Oskar Karpa. With this schematic map, we would like to give a rough overview of the most important salvage sites of the Brandenburg Provincial Association. Its own buildings were initially used for its own holdings. The cellars under the administrative headquarters at Alte Jaeckel 67 in Potsdam, which is number 1 south of Berlin. Yeah, I can't show. And the provincial estates of Goldbeck, number 3 northwest of Berlin, and Rotes Loch, number 2 in the east. The sites of Paritz, number 4, and Metzeltin, number 5, will be discussed in more detail later. Karnzow Manor, number 6, owned by the Count of Königsmark, became famous in an unfortunate way after 50 eminent paintings, 1,715 drawings, and around 3,000 graphic works from the Kunsthalle Bremen got lost here at the end of the war. Professor Eichwil can tell you more about this. However, Karnzow, like the Havelberg Museum of Local History here in number 9 and Golzow Palace, number 8, as well as probably also the pretty Steinhöfel Palace shown under number 7, was a direct point of contact for private individuals looking for safe storage for their works of art. Paritz Palace, located northwest of Potsdam, in Havelland, was assigned to Karpa for occupancy at the beginning of June 1944, alongside with art objects from the palace administration itself, but also from the Hohenzollern Museum, the Zeughaus, and the Potsdam Garrison Museum. Private property was also relocated to Paritz, belonging to the Hohenzollerns themselves, the Zur-Lippe family, and others. 9 of the total of 60 paintings housed in Paritz by the Zur-Lippe family, including numerous ancestral paintings, which had been left behind in Paritz and brought to the new palace in 1951, were restituted to the family in 2008. Among them was, as part of the so-called Biesterfeld family treasure, the portrait of Count Hermann Zur-Lippe by Jakob Leinendecker, shown here. In contrast to these 9 paintings, other cultural assets stored in Paritz were confiscated by trophy brigades of the Soviet Art Committee and taken to the USSR, including Emil Richter's landscape near Ostia, property of the Administration of Palaces and Gardens, shown here at the bottom right in a pre-war photograph. It arrived at the Moscow Pushkin Museum in a PZK2 crate. The abbreviation PZ, which hints to Paritz, appears in a further 51 crates containing a total of 45 items of furniture and clocks, 17 paintings, and 3 musical instruments, all of them still unidentified. Since a great deal of valuable furniture from the Hohenzollerns the Zulippe family and others were stored in pirates, it can be assumed that the PZ crates also contained privately owned works. Interestingly, among the items stored in pirates was also valuable furniture from the family of the Berlin private banker Warschauer, whose son Robert Tewos brought them in. The family goes back to the German Jewish family of scholars, bankers, and artists Mendelssohn. Robert Tewos and his mother Adele discarded the name Warschauer in 1938 for fear of NS reprisals and henceforth used Adele's maiden name Tewos. This is one of the rare examples known to us of private individuals of Jewish origin who were able to place their works of art in the custody of the authorities. The Metzeltin Menne house in northern Brandenburg was one of the salvage locations that Oskar Karpa recommended to private collectors for the safekeeping of their valuable art possessions. In addition to storage by the Ministry of Propaganda and the film production company UFA, numerous private individuals accepted the offer. The list in the slide does not include all users, among them, again, the Hohenzollern family. A total of 15 consignors of cultural assets can be found in the files of the Brandenburg Main State Archives. Among them was Karper himself, with an oil painting and a chalk drawing. Others were Josef Schitthoff, who stored furniture for the antique department of the Wertheim Company Berlin, Paul Franz Bang with several carpets and bridges, a piece of furniture, limewood sculpture, and several paintings, including one by Christian Rolfs. Max Bribilla, who according to his own statement was working for the Control Commission for Germany in November 1945, brought furniture, several engravings and carpets, some pieces of applied art, 4 paintings, and his entire library to Metzeltin. Nicolas Mouffang, artistic director of the Royal Porcelain Factory, Berlin, the KPM, moved original porcelain, original ceramics, paintings, etchings, and books to Metzeltin. The sculptor Fritz Klimsch, 26 bronzes and other pieces. The art historian Wilhelm Pinder brought a wooden sculpture of a Baroque saint. A Schmidt-Burg, mentioned without a first name, who contributed 3 portraits, is presumably Edgar Schmidt-Burg, son of the well-known director of the Reif Museum in Aachen, Max Schmidt-Burg. According to Wikipedia, Edgar Schmidt-Burg worked for the Reich Ministry of Propaganda and took part in a follow-up meeting to the Wannsee Conference. So this is a diversity in actors. It's 2 sentences. To conclude, in the course of our research into private collections during World War II, it was striking to realize that far more than 500 private collectors in Berlin alone accepted the protective measures offered by state authorities and museums. In Brandenburg, there were considerably fewer, with a total of 22 collections identified to date. In Berlin, an official structure coordinated by provincial and state conservators and museum curators quickly emerged. Similar attempts were made in smaller cities and in the countryside, but were less well received. This will still have to explained. Let me give a last retrospect. In retrospect, it can be said that the well thought out and organized state salvage measures, including the cooperation between museums and state authorities, did not prove successful overall. In the final months of the war and after the end of hostilities, the widely dispersed salvage sites were affected in different ways by the shifting of borders and the division into 4 occupation zones. Particularly in the former eastern part of the Reich, on the other side of the Oder and Neisse rivers, the general order disintegrated, making it difficult or impossible to repatriate the cultural assets that had been moved here. Thank you for your attention. Sorry.
Alles in Ordnung. I don't know about you, my head is spinning with all these different sites. I should have also said that if anybody has a burning question, wants to ask it in German, please feel free. I will do a quick translation. But I have already hands up. Yes, please. Oh. Is the mic on?
Can you hear
Yeah.
me? I have a question about Scharf-Gartenberg collection, and especially about the most important painting of this collection, Place de la Concorde by Degas. The question is that after the Second World War, Wildenstein claimed that this painting belonged to him and provided American authorities with documentation proving that the painting was sold to him by the family before the war, which Americans found valid, and even were sending American diplomats to the Hermitage to see is it exhibited or not. Which is creating a very interesting situation, because if these documents are truly valid, Scharf-Gartenberg family misleaded German authorities, basically given to the Nazi authorities a painting which belonged to the most important Jewish art dealer in the world for safekeeping, which is creating quite ironic situation. The second comment, which I want to develop in private conversation, there are indications that there are quite a few works from the Peschke list in one of the former Soviet republics. But this I want to discuss personally.
You're welcome. Great, thanks.
I don't know what any of us can contribute anything to the Wildenstein conundrum here, but it's an interesting story. I hadn't heard that one. Anybody else, please?
There is a file in the National Archives in Ardila whole collection fully describing the situation, I think by now available online.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Enough.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And I have a quick question about the Lower Silesian episode. Do you seek within the frame of your project to reach maybe and try to find out what happened by, I don't know, surveying the Polish archives, reaching to the population, or this is beyond the reach of what you do currently?
At the moment, not. Not at the moment. We have difficulties to get things done here.
I'm not surprised with that list.
I'm asking because this seems to me like particularly interesting, this point when the history of a German Jewish private collection became entangled actually with the Polish history.
Yeah.
So it's really, it's very telling and representative, but I understand that it entails a lot of difficulties. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, we were thinking to talk about that or not, but it's too interesting. So it got a little bit longer. Thank you for your
Neumann,
attention.
please.
Thank you for this very interesting morning. I have a question to all three presentations, and it's because I have an oral testimony by a German diplomat who had a painting from a Ukrainian museum given in the 90s to a German museum under the radar. So they used diplomatic transport and to establish diplomatic relationships. Is there a study, did this happen to other artworks? So the artwork at the beginning was given from the Soviet Union to the other republics. It was before 1990. These artworks, which were looted from Germany, had been distributed to other museums. And once the wall came down and the political structure maps were different, it seems that this was used to establish cultural diplomacy. And is there other cases, and would this be a topic?
Well, I think the only example I know is the Baldin case, where Baldin himself brought works of art to the consulate. Am I right? Here's the specialist sitting among us. But except from that, I don't know.
Right. Oh, if it's longer, maybe we should take it to the lunch break. I don't know about you. We have 12 o'clock, so that's landing punctually. We have to thank you above all.